Alrighty, hey folks, this is James Dean with Nowhere Special. I'm doing another tasting this week. This week we're going to be featuring Michter's bourbon out of Kentucky. Michter started off in Pennsylvania, but have a little bit more history later in the tasting for that. But we'll be starting off with Michter's small batch U.S. Star 1 Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. This comes in at 45.7% alcohol by volume, 91.4 proof. So it's going to be a little bit higher than some of the other proof, like 80 proof whiskeys. It's going to give you a little bit more of a bourbon, a little bit more of an ethanol kick to it. Right on the nose, you get hints of caramel, toasted oak, light baking spices, maybe a little cinnamon, touch of vanilla. Has a nice, really good, rich caramel color to it. Not too dark, not too light. But just classic bourbon notes on the nose. Going in. Kind of light. You definitely get notes of caramel, vanilla, oak. It's not a huge bourbon. It's not going to be overstepping any boundaries, but it's a nice entry-level sipping bourbon that I'm not going to say has a ton of depth. Like the palate doesn't like really linger that long. It does kind of dissipate kind of quickly with a little bit of note of honeysuckle, caramel, lighter sweet notes on the end, but relatively smooth. Like this would be a decent mixing bourbon, a sipping bourbon. It has a little touch of heat on the finish at the end. I get a little bit of that, but nothing too overbearing. If you're drinking like 114 proof and stuff like that, this is definitely easier on the palate. But this is gonna MSRP for around 40 to 50 bucks. This one is relatively easy to find. This and the straight rye are gonna be kind of like the go-to for most people. But yeah, really good starter bourbon to the flake. Next, we're going to be moving on, but right now, yeah, very nice. Yeah, light, no complaints. Not really over complex, but definitely a good tasting, bright bourbon. Next, we're going to be moving on to Michter's Small Batch US 1 Unblended American Whiskey. So this comes in at 41.7% alcohol by volume, 83.4 proof. So this is going to be a little bit more of like your session go-to kind of whiskey. So it's an American whiskey. So there's not enough corn into it to be a bourbon, and there's not enough rye into it to be a rye. So, and it's also aged in what they like to call used whiskey barrels, whiskey soaked barrels. So what they're using is either ex-bourbon barrels, ex-American whiskey, so it's going to have a little bit more of a subtler finish to it. But let's give this a try. Batch number 22L3270. So I can see right off the bat, this is slightly lighter than the bourbon. Not by much. Nose has less of that caramel note to it, but you definitely get some like butterscotch, still vanilla, but on a lighter note. Maybe some dried fruit. This one also MSRP is for around the same price as the bourbon, around 40 to 50 bucks. Yes, definitely much lighter notes on the nose, but that's still classic whiskey, cinnamon, not cinnamon, vanilla and other notes. On the palate, definitely lighter honey, vanilla, very smooth. It's not overly complex or hot, so it is like 10 proof down from where the bourbon was. 91, 80, yeah, so it's about like 7 or 8 points down So it's definitely a little bit smoother, less hot than where that bourbon was. Very clean on the palate. This is a very good, this is like a good session whiskey that you can just kind of like sip on during the summer. It's not overly hot, not overly complicated. A good American whiskey. This kind of reminds me of kind of where it's not an Irish whiskey, but kind of where Irish whiskey is, where it's not bright, it's not offensive, it's mellowed and kind of like caramel and butterscotch. I don't get the apple, but like in Irish whiskey, sometimes you get a little bit more of like a green apple note to it, but this kind of slightly reminds me of like an Irish whiskey in blend, kind of like that very smooth, non-offensive way. Almost creamy, like very subtle, very light, just a well played. It just tastes good across the board. But yeah, so Michter's Unblended American Whiskey, 83.4 proof, aged in ex-whiskey barrels, whiskey-soaked barrels, as I like to call it. There we are. Cheers. All right, and next we have Michter's Small Batch US1 Original Sour Mash Whiskey. This puppy's coming in at 43%, 83 proof. This is where I have a little bit of the history of Michter's. So Michter's, the original distillery, was from Shafferstown, Pennsylvania, founded in 1753. It changed through a few owners over the decades while there, and ended up being Michter's in 1950s. During that time frame, they from the 70s and 80s, while it was in Pennsylvania, the sour mash whiskey, which like Jack Daniel's is sour mash whiskey. Sour mash whiskey just means that you take a little bit of the distillate or a little bit of the mash from the first time that you brewed it and add that as your starter for the yeast in the next batch. So you're not killing off your yeast, you're not distilling away or burning away your yeast. This is kind of what like breweries do. So they use a starter from their previous batch mash, their sour mash, and their new mash, where it always kind of keeps that that yeast going. Where there's stuff like Peerless, which does a sweet mash bill, which means they pitch new yeast each time to keep a bit more of a consistent control. So yeah, during the 70s and 80s, Michter's Sour Mash was one of their like largest top sellers, where in 1989 the distillery went bankrupt and poof, went gone. Got bought again in 2004 and opened up in Louisville, Kentucky. And then in 2012 is when Michter's re-released their Sour Mash Whiskey, and here we are again, opening it for the first time. Weirdly enough, one of my loyal customers and good friends gave me a Michter's Sour Mash from the original Pennsylvania distillery. So thank you, Roberta, for that. Much appreciated. And let's give this a try. So in color, pretty much the same as the other two. I would probably say this is right around where the Unblended is. The bourbon seems to be, no, never mind. They're all about the same amber golden hue. This I get kind of much more like candy, sugar, fruit, caramel, baking spices. Lots of those like typical sweeter whiskey notes. By no means is it sour. It's still just a whiskey. But yeah, very, very well balanced. Little notes of, yeah, just baking spices, vanilla, cinnamon, your typical, like bright brown whiskey flavors. And going in, like just classic whiskey flavors, very light in body, honey, vanilla, light oak. Like it's not overly aged, but these All three of these are very good, like drinking, sipping, summer, go-to, just drink, drink straight whiskeys. They're not overly harsh or complex where you're gonna really need to sit and stew on it. These are just all like really good renditions of what they do. This is gonna MSRP again for around like that 40 to 50 bucks, depending on where you find it. Maybe like candied cherries, dark fruit. Definitely a good nose to it. Like just all of those baking spices, vanilla, cinnamon, caramel. Cheers. That's nice. Yep. Everything's very smooth. Everything's delicious. Cheers. All right, just the camera a little bit, so we got a little bit better of a viewpoint. Now we're going to be moving on to some of the harder stuff to find from Michter's, their single barrel ryes. So of the easiest to find from Michter's is going to be their single barrel US Star 1 Kentucky Straight Rye Whiskey. This comes in at 42.4% by volume, 84.8 proof. Again, so this is going to be 51% rye, aged on new char oak barrels, single barrel, so it's different than the other small batch stuff. So this is going to be single expressions of its own, each rye is its own expression. So the color is definitely a little bit more darker and butterscotch in color. Sorry, bit of a mess. Yeah, definitely a richer, darker hue. And this is going to MSRP between all the other stuff that we tasted, the small batch and the unblended and the sour mash, around like 40 to 50 bucks. All of the first four are all relatively easy to find. Definitely butterscotch on the nose, spice, a little bit of citrus. You definitely get some oak on the back there. Nice spicy rye. This one makes a nice Manhattan. So definitely butterscotch on the front, spicy caramel, cinnamon, a little bit of pepper on the finish, kind of just sparkles there for a little bit. Yeah, not overly complex. A little bit of spice, a little bit of oak, a little bit of butterscotch. It's got a balance to it where it's enough spice, enough sweet, but to keep it all kind of really nice. A little bit of warmth there. For 84 proof, that's not like super hot, but it's good. It's nice. It's a good rye. Tasty. So that's Michter's US 1 single barrel rye whiskey. And next we're going to move on to Michter's limited release US 1 barrel strength Kentucky straight rye whiskey. This is coming in at 53.3% by volume, 106.6 proof. So this is going to be a barrel select, straight from the barrel rye. So same as the other rye, nice beautiful dark hue to it. A little bit darker than the bourbons in the American. More butterscotch, more baking, more cinnamon, cherries, vanilla. Much more deeper, like where the small or the straight barrel rye, you're down around 84 proof. Everything's going to be a little bit more muted. Everything's going to be a little bit more like kind of washed away because they proofed it down. Where this is barrel strength, and they put their bourbon or their rye, their whiskey into the barrels at a lower proof to maximize flavor profile. So it's kind of what Wild Turkey does as well, where you don't put in too high of a spirit where you're watering it down. That spirit kind of just collects more and more of that flavor profile. So yeah, lots of, again, that vanilla baking spice. I don't really get any of the mint or any kind of that bright note that you'd get from other like younger ryes. I'm not exactly sure of the age statement on this, but being a single barrel, they choose when it's ready, not how old it is. But yeah, each you know, obviously it's barrel proof, so they bottle at whatever the proof ABV was when they harvest it. Let's go in. Cheers. Much bigger in flavor. It kind of coats the entire palate, warms the back of the throat. Butterscotch, honey, caramel, cinnamon, nutmeg, all of those baking spices, warm, holiday, like spice cake, Christmas, like ham. It doesn't have a savory, but like all of those like baking spices remind me of like a warm kitchen where there's like something in the oven and like you get all of that like honey, like a honey glaze kind of. All those spices, warm. Yeah, that's a really nice barrel proof rye. So these are a little bit harder to get. They MSRP around $100 a bottle, but like secondary on the internet, I was going through and looking through, and like they're asking, secondary says around $250. As you know, if you talk to me, I don't really believe in secondary, but you know, like if someone's out there dropping $250, good for you. But at $100. This is something that, you know, like you might want to grab and give it a try, but if you don't want to drop the 100, it's worth, you know, picking up the tasting and giving a sip here, because it's a deliciously complex whiskey that you might not be able to get your hands on, but I definitely recommend giving it a try. Like baking spices up the wazoo. And then at 106, you don't get that much alcohol burn. It's very fluid and fluffy and kind of like, yeah, just nice. Like it is spicy, warm without being too hot. It's a tasty rye. Michter's limited release barrel strength Kentucky straight rye whiskey. Cheers. All right, and then finishing off this, I was able to get one bottle of these. So the Michter's is a 21 release, and the same with this Michter's single barrel 10-year-old Kentucky straight rye whiskey. This is proofed down a little bit, so this is going to be 46.4% alcohol by volume, 92.8 proof. This again is one of those like limited, kind of harder to release, harder to find ones. It MSRPs for around 170. And I've seen secondary values, again, if anyone trusts those, up around like 350. Yeah, I only got one bottle of this, but let's give her a try. So this is going to be batch number 21E1567. According to the website, this is one of the most like limited release ones they released. They started releasing it back in 2014. So yeah, much bigger notes than even the single barrel of like vanilla, dark fruit, like almost like a plum, peppery notes, a little bit of citrus. Weirdly enough, I do get like a little ethanol, like almost like a touch of like nail polish remover. That's where the alcohol kind of pokes through a little bit, and it's surprising at like 92 proof, but that also just could be like the age of like the oak kind of popping through a little bit more. Toffee Vanilla. Let's give her a try. Yeah, darker, slightly darker than the single barrel, but still a really nice dark golden hue. Ooh, wow. Ooh, oaky. You get the tannins right on the top of the mouth. It kind of coats everything with this oak, toffee, vanilla, cinnamon. But like 10 years on oak, like the oak for me on the front is the predominant flavor profile. Then it kind of mellows out a little bit, a little peppery, like toasted nuts, like toasted almonds almost. On the second sip, a bit more citrus, a bit more orange. But yeah, like oaky vanilla, oaky cinnamon. Those rye spices have mellowed, and yeah, it's definitely a 10-year rye. Like the oak is saturated through most of the flavors. It mellows everything out, but like it's kind of like almost like a really light tobacco note, like not smoky, but just a roasty kind of light leather. Like it is, you know, like a 10-year definitely gives you a bit more of that like complex flavor profile, but quite delicious. It's in comparison to the single barrel, definitely has a much different breadth of flavor, a much, you know, it's kind of mellowed out a bit more. It doesn't have the high proof, and it just kind of lingers with this kind of, you know, oaky leather baking spice. Quite nice. Yeah. So that's the Michters that I have. I appreciate the views and the enjoy. You can pick up the flights or just watch on the website. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much. Cheers, folks.